Welcome everybody to one of DoSpace's webinars. This is online resources for the election. It is going to be presented to you by Pat Wagner. Pat is coming to us from Denver, Colorado, and she and her husband run Pattern Research, which is a productivity or the kind of workplace organization that helps improve productivity and supports career advancement through libraries, higher education, and local government, nonprofits, and small businesses. So she is just like really knowledgeable about so many different things. She's done so many different webinars with us the last several months, so we're excited to have her back. And so, yes, I'm going to let her get started for us to talk about online research for the election.
Great, and thank you folks for joining us today. My background is as a trainer and a consultant, and I've worked for different political campaigns, and one of the rules that I have is if people are honest, if they're honest about both the pros and cons of what they're campaigning about, treat people with respect, more than likely, I'm willing to help them with their campaign because, above all, I believe in a marketplace of ideas. Also, besides helping people with campaigns, I also actually ran for the mayor of Denver in 1991, which I lost. And I did it partly, I knew I wouldn't be elected, but I did it partly to do research. And so I've done a lot of research over the years about what happens behind the scenes. One of the reasons I was pleased to be asked to do this program is I'm very concerned about people kind of not paying attention to local elections because of the national campaigns. So this is definitely going to be focused locally. We know that people might be watching this from outside of the Omaha area, but I have focused on Omaha, Nebraska, but the kind of resources I'm talking about are available pretty much anywhere, which is good. And every program I do has a key idea, and the key idea today is make up your own mind and make it up smartly, not just react to things pros and cons. I grew up in Chicago, and at a time where the first Mayor Daley was probably the most powerful politician in the United States. And I learned to be suspicious of all politicians in all elections. In fact, everything you've ever heard about Chicago elections are true. When our family were immigrants, and when I go to a family party, politics was a big deal. And I remember when my Uncle Harry, who was the patriarch of the family, showed up at a family party and proudly announced that the ward boss for his precinct, in effect, had assigned him to vote Republican because they couldn't have straight Democratic voting because it would make the federal government suspicious. So the ward bosses for the Democratic Party would actually appoint people to vote Republican. And my Uncle Harry took that as a sign of respect that they trusted him to vote Republican. So you have to understand my bias as I look at a lot of things skeptically. But I really think regardless of who you want to be elected and what your stand is on issues, make up your own mind. Make up your own mind. Don't let someone else make up your mind for you. So we're going to talk about the PPR, Pat's Principles of Personal Political Research, what I think works best, signs that you might be being manipulated by whoever and how to lower that manipulation, some of my favorite general online resources regarding politics and information, and then some specific resources I found for Omaha and Nebraska and your region. And one thing that I have to say is that I found many good resources. So I kind of picked what I thought was reasonable, and I also rejected one that were just from one side of the aisle or the other, that were just for people who were left-wing or people who were right-wing. So I tried to eliminate as best as I could information sources that were there to push a cause or an issue, and so that I felt that their information was maybe a little bit more objective. And finally, don't wait to vote. Who knows what's going to be happening in coming weeks? Sooner you get your vote in and tabulated and everything, the better, in my opinion. So first of all, Pat's Principles of Personal Political Research. All right, first of all, you need to really know the local issues, and this is homework. This is homework. I just talked to a friend in South Carolina who was looking at something, and she told me for one issue it took her 2 hours of research. I timed myself because Colorado, and particularly Denver, our ballot this year is 6 pages long because we referendum everything, which I think is really stupid. I think it's horrible that citizens get to meddle with our state constitution, often for little piddly stuff. Anyways, off my soapbox. So it's going to take some time to go through these different issues. And it's more than just looking at Twitter and looking at what the tweet says. It really has to do with going to different sources and thinking about it. And again, making up your own mind. And being able to be honest to yourself, particularly when it's issues rather that you're voting on rather than people, is that there's always another side to the story. There's always another side to the story. So I was just talking before we got in about a bill that is for approval by the citizens having to do with introducing wolves back into Colorado. And at first glance, it might be something that my husband and I would think was a good idea. But you know what? It took me a lot of research, and it took me about an hour and a half online looking at federal agencies, state agencies, nonprofit organizations, newspaper articles, not just from Colorado, but from Idaho and Montana, to figure out what was going on. And by the end of the research we did, we decided to vote differently than what we planned to when we first looked at it superficially. So I want you to be like an honest scholar. I want you to be like a professor, willing to look at the pros and cons of all sides of the issues. And sometimes it's not binary. It's not either or. There's things are complex. I have voted against bills for new projects, for taxes for new projects where I really believed in the project, but the way that the law was put together was, I thought, kind of hinky. And I thought, no, I'm going to vote against this because I want a better version. So we're smart people. This is part of what we need to do. One thing that I was taught at a very early age, one of the best pieces of advice my dad gave me, look at who is paying for the campaign. This is public information mostly. What are their issues and who will benefit if a particular person is elected or if a particular bill is paid? And you know what? It's not so easy that there's good guys and there are bad guys. It's more important is who is going to benefit so that when that particular person is in office or that bill is paid, who is going to be the person or the group that will be wanting a particular outcome. And yes, we call these special interest groups. And even if you are in favor of the position of a special interest group, realize that that particular law or that particular person is supposed to represent all the people in your community, not just one side or the other. And what happens if a person comes up who wants to have a say in what's going on. And that's part of what happens when you build resentment between groups. I'm very proud of the fact that when I ran for mayor, even though it was almost symbolic, I really didn't have a chance, 2 of the local newspapers endorsed me, and 2 smaller papers. And I called up the publisher of one of the papers and I said, you know, you and I are on different sides of political issues about 80% of the time. Why did you endorse me? And he said, well, he said, Pat, you're an honest person. And I believe that if you were mayor of Denver and my group had an issue, you would listen to us thoughtfully, give us the time of day, and consider us and not just completely push us aside because we were different from you. And he said, that's what I'm looking for in a politician. So I think we have to look kind of behind the curtain too. And if it's like, you know, Citizens for a Better Nebraska, let's find out who Citizens for a Better Nebraska are and information about that. Again, most of that is supposed to be public things. Now, this is a funny one, and this is not always intentional, but it's really amusing when a candidate is making big statements about, I'm going to do this and that, and then you do a little research and find out, well, that's not even their job. For example, a few years ago, we were having a lot of trouble with the local education system here in Denver, and one of the mayoral candidates was saying, I'm going to change education, I'm going to do this and that. Well, that's well and good, but we have a separate school district, a separate school board that is in no way attached to municipal government, and he would have absolutely no clout and no authentic, how would you say, no authentic authority to be able to do anything. But boy, it looked good on the brochures. So one thing that I look at is when people start checking off their issues, one of the things I don't take for granted is, do they actually have legitimate power and authority, or are they just doing this because it's an important issue everyone's talking about and they're hoping the voters don't notice? So that's something that I always think is interesting. Like, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. Well, that's fine, but then you have to be running for a different office if you want to do that. Uh, I have to say, I don't watch speeches. I don't watch debates. I don't even read the party platforms necessarily, unless that person is basically just obedient to everything is on the platform of their particular group. What I'm interested in is their history on what decisions they have made, what actions they've taken, and what votes they have cast. So if they are somebody who has a background in politics, yeah, I want to know what they've done in the past and I want to know what they voted for. People can change their mind, and I don't think that's hypocritical. I've changed my mind about things. I bet you have changed your mind about things. But I really want to see what what patterns there are, including how they get along with other people. We're going to talk about that in a minute. If they're new to politics, I want to see what kinds of decisions they made in their life before that as well. So I try to do research. Sometimes it's just concerning because you have people who've never done anything in the public sector before at all, and they're running for office. So you really don't know what they're going to do. And again, my experience has been you can't always judge somebody by what they say when they're on a podium, particularly if they're reading somebody else's speech. So yeah, I have judiciously stayed away from watching most of what's going on at the national level because, from my point of view, that's meaningless. What people say is meaningless. What's more interesting is what they're actually doing behind the scenes. So if they were new to politics, what did they do before they were in office? Now, something that I really admire about our former mayor and governor, John Hickenlooper, and so you know, he's also a friend of mine, and he was a client of mine when he first moved to Denver, is that John made a lot of money running an incredibly successful restaurant. And when he got interested in politics, before he ran for politics, he went and served on all of those horrible committees. I shouldn't say horrible, but yeah, they're horrible committees where you sit around and talk endlessly about little stupid issues. I shouldn't say it like that. But you know, the zoning board and the housing board and then this board and then that board. And you spend a huge amount of time at boring meetings talking about all the little details that it takes to run a city, and then have to go to public meetings where you have to interact with the general public, which is sometimes fun, sometimes invigorating, sometimes horrifying, right? And he did that for several years before he decided to run for mayor. And it was interesting that when he ran, both the left-leaning and the right-leaning newspapers in town all endorsed him. And one of the reasons they endorsed them, they said he did his homework. Our current governor in Colorado did a similar thing. He actually multimillionaire, made his fortune in business. And then what he did is before he ran for governor, he was on the state education commission. He really believed in education and best education. So he educated himself working again on smaller boards, smaller causes and stuff before he ran for office. So you absolutely knew a lot about those guys before they were in the public sector. I'm interested, for example, in the school board meetings, I'll look elections, I'll look for people, and a lot of times you have someone who says, "No, I've never run for office before, but look at all of the groups I was involved in, the causes I was involved in, and this group and that group, and this is what we accomplished. Not just that I was a member of the group, but these are the things I accomplished." And I always look for phrases like "worked with both sides of the aisle," "was able to build coalitions," among different people. So those are the kinds of things I look at. Sometimes you can find them on their sites, sometimes not. Um, Another thing we have to be aware of, and this goes back to the downside, the dark side of marketing. In marketing, we are taught to have a focus, right? We have a particular person or candidate, I mean, a person or a cause or something. It's like that one thing that we're working on, and that's our message. And even before the electronic era, it was like, what's the message, right? I like Ike. That was the message. Who are you voting for and why? But the thing is that if you're an elected official, particularly at the local level, there's a whole bunch of stuff that you have to do. So again, you might have someone who says, well, in our town, I'm going to be focused on working with education. Okay, that's well and good. What about the fact that you have to deal with the renewal of the union contracts with the police and the firefighters? How come you suddenly have to be an expert about water and sewage? That you have to look at construction contracts. You have to look at, oh my goodness, we have to repave a bunch of roads, and the roads haven't been repaved for 40 years. So given new technology, what kinds of things that should we be thinking about? And we hired 3 different consultants who were telling us 3 different things. So a lot of it is sort of like when you own a house and you're worried about how to fix the roof and how to fix the plumbing and things that are not particularly glamorous. So my concern is that they may have that one big issue they're running on, but what about all the other stuff they have to do to be good at their job? And one thing I did, which I'm very proud of, is that I developed a training program for elections for candidates for public office, and got to do this for some fire districts and different community groups and stuff, mostly in Colorado and a couple of other states. And we would talk about this, and we'd have people who were in office present to the candidates and say, now this is what the reality is of the position you're seeking. And most of the people were like, I didn't know that. I didn't know that. I have no idea what kind of research they did before they decided to run for public office, but they really were grateful. A couple of mayors ago, Wellington Webb, who was mayor of Denver, he had kind of a boot camp for a weekend for all the candidates for city council and different positions, including the mayor of Denver. And he would go through a whole bunch of stuff with different people, say this is what a typical day is, these are the issues, and also stuff that was public knowledge, but things like these are contracts coming up that have to be renewed. These are bond issues that we have to know about. Here are technical things that we have to know about. This is what you're going to have to be worried about your first month or two in office, about bringing together a team and hiring people. Here's some awful things you're going to inherit. Here's a scandal going on, like with a contractor, that guess what, you're going to have to deal with that when you're in office. And again, most of the people didn't know about this. So the one issue candidates make me cranky. And I hope on their websites that they have more about who they are. And it can't just be about, well, here's my position on the issues, because most of the time they're not going to be dealing with those issues. So that's another part of research. On the other hand, we have to look in our heart and we have to say, we may have some overwhelming issue in our lives, a cause that is the litmus test of whether or not we approve of a particular candidate. So I have friends that their litmus test is the feminist movement. I have friends who the litmus test is taxes. I have friends who the litmus test is abortion. I have friends who the litmus test is um, climate, global warming and the climate, or the environment, or pollution or what their vote is going to be regarding banning pit bulls in Denver. I mean, right? That one issue, and you don't stand back and say, well, I got my issue voted for, I'm done. I mean, all the different things that are going to affect you and your neighbors. So I have voted for candidates who did not pass my litmus test. But you know what? Who I thought would make better candidates, who were better well-rounded, who I thought would look at all the issues, not just my one issue. And I had a friend who voted, who was a third-party candidate, third-party person. He switched to one of the major parties, got elected, and he came in very idealistically with issue, his one issue. And he found that there were dozens of issues that he had to think about, and that he was terrible at building coalitions because he'd go to talk to another elected official, another state senator, and he told me all this later and admitted he did a terrible job. And all he wanted to do was, let's do this, let's do this. And the guy would be like, well, here's 15 other bills that we have to consider. Which ones are you in support of, and so on. And this man was a lawyer and smart, but he said it was a very sobering experience, that he made a lot of assumptions and he was so focused on that issue. And we as voters, I don't think we should have one issue, one issue. Now, I have to admit that if there was a candidate who said, I can clean up the Veterans Administration and clean up the VA because we've had terrible problems in Colorado, and I felt he could do it, it would be really hard for me not to vote for that person regardless of the other issues. Or if somebody said, yes, I'm going to ban all the puppy mills in our area, that would be really hard for me to vote against that person. So I have some, litmus tests myself, but being a one issue voter is, I think, short-sighted. I think it's short-sighted. There's so many other things we have to be worried about in our towns, dozens of issues and causes. I've hinted about this as well. Plays well with others. Plays well with others. And this is something you sometimes hear people who are commenting on what's happening with politics. Campaigning is different from governing. In campaigning, you're trying to identify and strengthen your base. Your base are the people who will elect you to office, whether or not you've actually committed first-degree murder on videotape, okay? They'll forgive you anything, but you want to make sure your base actually comes to the polls. You want to excite your base on those 3 or 4 issues that they care about and are the ones who are going to vote for you because you passed their litmus test, right? And so you're always sort of making speeches about, yes, 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 we're going to improve the Veterans Administration, and yes, 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 we're going to shut down all the puppy mills. And Pat Wagner saying, well, yeah, that's my woman. I'm going to vote for them. Yay, yay, yay. But when you're governing, it's a lot different. And it's no longer us against them. It's very much that we have to figure out a way to work together. And even if you are elected to office and your group has most of the votes, trust me, you still have to work with the other side. It's not simply sort of black and white. And that kind of pragmatism often outrages idealists. There's I'm going to say G.W. Bailey, but there is a famous anthropologist and sociologist who's done amazing studies all over the world having to do with politics in villages and towns among indigenous people, amazing things. And one of the things that he points out is that it's often not about if somebody is left-wing or right-wing, it's about the idealist versus the pragmatist. And in most elections, while the person is campaigning, they're an idealist because they're focused on 2 or 3 issues. When they're governing, suddenly they're a pragmatist. And sometimes when they switch to a more pragmatic view, the next election, they lose those idealistic votes because you don't do this stuff in isolation. So I'm interested, regardless of what the person's position is, how they get along with other people. And I don't care what your political position is at all, but I thought it was very telling that when Hillary Clinton became senator in New York, and I followed her career and read up a lot about it. A lot of the people on both sides of the aisle were very much in praise of her as a senator because she basically kept her mouth shut the first months and even year or two she was there. She studied, she did her research, she showed up early, she stayed late, she talked to people, she listened. And she realized that her job was to build those connections with everybody, not just people from the Democratic Party. And so I always thought of that as really an ideal. How do they do that? And what evidence do you have that they're going to work with people on both sides? So we have to remember, folks, campaigning is different from governing. The idealism of campaigning is different from the pragmatism of governing. And that's why if you, which I've tried to do on occasion, if you keep a list of campaign promises and then you watch what people do, you know what? You might find that the person that you elected into office on those one or two issues that were important to you actually aren't accomplishing the things they said they did. Because once they're in office, boy, things look different, and they're privy to knowledge that maybe they weren't allowed to see while they were campaigning. And sometimes when you see someone take an action, like me watching this, you might say, gee, I bet they're eating their words now. And you usually know that they found out stuff they didn't know before. So plays well with others is something that I think we need to research about anyone who's elected to office. So, boy, is this a big issue now about are you being manipulated and how? And a lot of this isn't about nefarious groups in other countries. It's just the everyday thing that happens when we're reading something online, reading the paper, reading a brochure that we've been taught in marketing to use all this fancy sales knowledge to make things sound important. This is the best car you've ever bought. This is the best wine you'll ever drink. This is the best house. This is the best anything. And then guess what? We take that same kind of language and we use it in marketing political issues and people for public office. So the con game, and we could do like 4 programs just on this, include things like you read something and it looks like a fact, but then you look at it again and realize it's somebody's opinion or it's their interpretation of what happened. In fact, one little exercise I've done with people on this is I've had them take a commentary, article, whatever about a particular issue, and then what they have to do is edit out all the adjectives and adverbs. And once you edit out all the adjectives and adverbs, you are more likely to get to the gist of what's going on. So there's a lot of ways that we con each other, and then some of them are pretty benign. If somebody says this is the best hamburger you'll ever eat, I think that most thinking people know that this is not actually the best hamburger you're ever going to eat. But that same kind of language is used when we're selling things. And even though I'm disgruntled by it and I find it irritating, the sad thing is it tends to work with most people, consciously or unconsciously. And I've talked to friends who are, quote, real journalists who've worked for major daily newspapers or TV stations, and they said, yeah, we all know this. We all know that um, that to write headlines to get people to read, we have to make the headlines exciting and use a lot of adjectives. And sadly, if you start keeping count, you'll notice that sometimes the headlines about a cause have nothing to do with what was actually stated. And that's something that we have to be careful about as well. I use Snopes. I use Snopes a lot. And it bothers me because a lot of the work I do is with academics and librarians, how often people who are supposed to be information specialists repost an article or a meme or a story or an accusation. It's usually an accusation of one side or the other, and never use Snopes to basically say, oh yeah, that photo that shows that Pat Wagner was there in front of the puppy mill that she owned, that actually was something that was taken of Pat 20 years ago, and she was in front of a camping ground and somebody photoshopped puppy mill in front of that, and that's what actually is going on. It bothers me how many people just hit return without looking at that. Now, sometimes I disagree with Snopes because I disagree with their interpretations. of the news. But when they are doing like, this is what happened this time and that time, um, and they aren't willing, I love it when they're not willing to get sucked into one interpretation or another, saying, this is what happened, why it happened, how it happened, what happened behind the magic curtain, we don't know, but I can say this. And I have to do that. I have to do this. I don't make a comment, but I do this maybe 2 or 3 times a day because I spend a lot of time online. And recently, I was so embarrassed, I had to do it with one of my favorite cousins. One of my very favorite cousins posted something, and I checked it on Snopes, and it was a lot more complicated than what she put in. So all I did was put the link in her timeline, and her being an intelligent, gracious, lovely woman, posted, about 10 minutes later and said, thanks, Pat. It is more nuanced than I put on. Thank you for doing this, right? So let's use Snopes, understanding it's not perfect, but basically it can tell you that, yeah, that was proven to be a hoax years ago. And this is the original photo, or this was the original thing, or this was never said or something. So it's my go-to. It's my go-to, I have to admit. Another caveat that we have to do when we're doing this kind of research is the issue of truth is not a democracy. And what we mean by that is that if you have a fact, just because a bunch of people say a fact is true doesn't make it a fact. I am horrified when I see scientists signing petitions and saying, since our side or the other side, we have more people on our piece of paper than the other side, that's a scientific fact. That's not how science works. That's why I have basically stepped away maybe in March from scientific discussion having to do with the pandemic, because we still don't know enough about that. But be careful of deciding you agree with something just because the majority of people that you agree with have signed a petition, or that one side has more names than the other, I guess is what I'm saying, because that's not how we do scientific research. It's just by, popularity polls in effect. And speaking of polls, I have a friend, Kathy Bradshaw, who's a professor at Ohio State University, and she has done a lot of research on the psychology of polls and polling and so on. And I, to refresh my knowledge, looked at 10 different recent studies having to do with the influence of polls. And you would have found it very amusing and frustrating, because they said, well, yes, there is something called the bandwagon effect, that if someone sees that someone is doing better in the polls, they're more likely to vote for them. It's kind of like when you're looking to buy a new piece of music and you see, oh, this was like #2 in popularity this year, it must be good. Gee, I'll buy that piece of music, right? Or right now, I was looking for new headphones for doing webinars and searched a lot. And I went, oh, yes, these are really good headphones because everyone says they are. Well, okay, but when we're talking about polling people, it's who they were able to get to talk to at that particular moment, who answered the phone, who responded to the email, who responded to the interview, what mood that person was in at the time. So when I look through these 10 different um, uh, articles related to different studies that have been done, mostly by academic organizations, every one of them said this: well, we think there's a bandwagon effect. We don't really, it's complicated, So we kind of intuitively think that polls maybe influence people, but maybe not. And so by the end of it, what you got was, be careful, but no one knows. All right, so I will pass on that sage advice from the experts. Be careful, but no one knows. But my advice is, treat the polls as entertainment, but don't let them make decisions for you. Okay, that's always my concern. So what are some of my favorite online resources? What's out there that I think are pretty good? And by the way, I think this is not maybe the space center, but a space center right now. Yeah, I think they're launching something. I thought this was a good thing to talk about. Favorite online resources. Okay. Now there's a site from the US government, usa.gov, and then it says election /office. And what you can do is you plug in your state and it gives you an amazing amount of information about elections and campaigns, and it's all these are the facts, folks. And I find that a lot of people don't have a good context about what's going on, or they wait till the last minute. So what you want to do is make sure nothing slips between the cracks, that since so many of us are using mail ballots these days, but even if you're not using a mail ballot, and even if you're just um, going into actual polling booth, which some people are, that you're prepared. You're prepared. You don't want to be making decisions in that curtained area or in the virtual curtain. Most of the states that I looked at, including Colorado, you can download, in effect, a paper ballot. You can download a draft of what you're looking for. And for those 6 pages of information we have, and 2 handbooks, it's a lot of information. One of the jobs that I'm going to be going through is using that paper ballot to check everything I need to, and then comparing it with the ballot that we've already received in the mail here in Colorado, and checking through. And I'm going to do the draft ballot in red ink so that it's really clear. And anything that I'm not sure if I'm going to use a different color ink. I love colors, maybe like a yellow marker or something like that. And then my husband and I have already sat down and talked a lot of these issues through. But then we're just going to see one at a time. So when it's time to actually do the ballot, the mail-in ballot, right, I will be able to have some information. So if you're at a point, or you know friends, family who they're just overwhelmed and clueless, you can find your state online. If maybe you're not Nebraska, maybe you're Iowa or South Dakota, and find the information you need. So I thought this was great. This was a great one here. Now this is just awesome. Fact checking the news. And this reporterslab.org, and I think it's out of Duke University. I think it is. But anyways, what they do is they have a map that shows you all of the fact-checking organizations at the local level throughout the world, which includes Colorado and Nebraska. So you can look at national and local fact-checking organizations, and you can compare the fact-checking organizations, which I think is really important too, because everybody has biases. That's why I said in my little intro in the print there, everyone has confirmation biases that we're not aware of, right? I mean, it's really hard not to. It's really hard to be a pure scholar. I have met very few in my life. So this is a great place to check what people are saying. But what it is it fact checks the media from all sides. And I have not been able to find any bias on the part of the organization itself. And then when you look at the different fact checking things, you can say, okay, are they this leaning or that leaning or whatever? So I thought this is so much fun. And by the way, I should mention that if you have kids at home and they're having assignments having to do with politics, even if they don't, a lot of the things we're talking about would be great information for them as well to do their research and really teach them that whole idea of being a scholar when you're doing it, and not just looking for information that confirms your own biases. Okay, so reporterslab.org, great group. Now, another thing we have to watch out for is that search engines like Google, who run by algorithms, can manipulate information. And it's not that necessarily there's a bunch of people in a closed room deciding which way they want people to vote, but the algorithms look for specific information. And sometimes they're really wrong. What was it that I was looking for online? Oh, salt-free blue corn chips. And I was looking on Amazon to get salt-free blue corn chips delivered to the house. And I typed in salt-free blue corn chips, which we've bought before. Well, it was pretty funny, the things that popped up, that somehow my writing blue corn chips, salt-free blue corn chips, had the little AI brain which isn't really artificial intelligence, it's just counting and sorting things, pop up. And we laugh, don't we? I mean, we laugh and say, how in the world did it decide I wanted that? How in the world are some of these goofy things appearing in my timeline on social media? You know, what little computer brain decided I wanted that? Well, unfortunately, the same thing is true with search engines. And sometimes you won't know how the search engine is sorting things. And unless I'm doing deep research on something, I don't go 10 or 15 or 20 pages in. I'm like you, I might go 1, 2, 3, 4 pages in. And it's amazing when you're using different search engines, how differently those results might appear, because we have to remember that when you're talking about a search engine like Google, people pay for the placement of their work. They pay advertising and so on. And the word advertising is in little teeny gray type. So you may not realize how much of what you're seeing in the timeline is based on who paid the most to be there. And as a businesswoman, we get calls, 2 or 3 calls a week from Google, for example, saying, here, you can buy this, you can buy that to improve your standing. So trying out different search engines is good. Lifehack.org is a great site. It's a lot of fun. And if you type in that number, you'll find different search engines, and then you can play a little experiment. And again, if you have kids, this is a great thing, make the kids do it. Type in a phrase, even a phrase as innocuous as politics, and type it into the search engines and see what comes up on that first 2 or 3 pages. You might be amazed at the differences among them. Oh, I'm in love with Ballotpedia. Ballotpedia.org. Wow and wow. When I'm rich, they're going to get a ton of money. It is one of the few what I would call objective election sites out there. And I didn't find it out until a couple of years ago. They're a nonprofit organization, and what they do in very matter-of-fact terms would say, here's the issue. They cut and paste stuff right from the organization so they don't color it one way or the other, and they give you the facts about a candidate. And anybody running for public office has this survey they fill out, and they will take out things like what the political platform says, what the person says, and if the candidate does not return the survey, they say that the candidate, we did not receive a return from them. But if I really want to look at what's going on, Ballotpedia is terrific and it's fun to use. And again, you can find your state very easily and look at the Nebraska elections or the Iowa or South Dakota elections or whatever, and get a lot of data about what's going on. And it's very interesting sometimes how much a candidate will reveal if they do choose to respond to the surveys or they have put stuff online. And a couple of times I've looked at stuff and think, oh my goodness, they said this? They actually put this in their survey and didn't think that all these people would be seeing what they put in. So yeah, I'm big fan of Ballotpedia. And again, nonprofit organization, and all they're dealing with is factual information without interpretation and without opinions. So, what are some of the things that I was able to find in Omaha? And again, I have to say that I found a ton of stuff that I rejected. Now, the first reason I rejected it is because it was repetitive. You know, that there were a lot of sites out there. I would say I found, without much trouble, 20 sites specifically related to Omaha and Nebraska um, elections, and at least half of them, it was just the same information in different forms. There was a couple, as I mentioned before, that it was not objective information, and it was particularly clear when I went to see who supported them. And my problem was that the information probably was good, but the fact that everybody from one side of the aisle supported them made me a little suspicious. It made me feel like, you could have found other people. You could have found other people. But anyway, let's take a look at what we have here. League of Women Voters has been around forever, and they are a go-to source for information. They promote um, ballots and things like that, and every state and every locality has them. And so this is the League of Women Voters in Nebraska. Unfortunately, I've had a personal experience with them going back a few years where I have to say that even the League of Women Voters can, on occasion, be tweaked for one side or the other. However, given that, they will give you the information about the candidates, but they also are very good at holding different kinds of face-to-face and now virtual meetings so that the candidates can debate and talk. And to be honest, I'm much more interested in listening to local candidates talk about their positions than I am the national folks. And I think it's very telling when you hear people, particularly are asked hard questions about issues they're supposed to support, or to be asked, okay, how well have you thought this through? In the old Dick Van Dyke Show, I don't know if anyone remembers this or not, there was a scene where the Dick Van Dyke's character, what is it, oh, Rob Petrie, decided to run for local office. And he was cute and charming, and he was a celebrity because he was a comedy writer and so on, and people loved him. And then the other candidate showed up, and he was a little quiet, nerdy, mousy guy with glasses, and it was very evident that he knew his stuff. He knew everything about whatever issue it was. I mean, he really was kind of awesome. He was extremely awesome in what he did. And by the end of it, it was obvious who was supposed to like win in effect. But I think of that sometimes when I watch people who are running for public office who don't seem to realize, particularly if the first time, they don't seem to realize that people are going to be watching them, that they're going to have to speak in public, that they'll have to, be up on a podium addressing questions to the general public. They'll have to be in social media. They'll have to be do these things. And what's sad is that there's some brilliant, wonderful, wonderful people who are terrific one-on-one and terrific about the ideas, but they aren't so good in front of an audience. And it kind of breaks my heart because I've seen at least a couple of candidates fail who I thought would have been terrific in the offices, but they weren't articulate. They didn't do well. We Roy Romer was governor of Colorado for I think four terms, and very popular. He had been our budget person, the treasurer or something of the state beforehand. And but when he was running for governor, he was kind of a good old boy. And he had grown up on a sugar beet farm and he maybe wasn't too polished. And he went to a lady who was the lady who polished everyone in those days. And she had him dye his hair, get a haircut, and wear different clothes. And she practiced his speech making. And the way she said it is, I didn't change how Roy presented himself. I just basically polished what was there. And so League of Women Voters is a place where you can find out about where candidates will be talking and speaking. And I think that's one of the most useful ways to use them, in effect, is to be able to find out how that person is going to be able to present their ideas. You don't want someone who's slick and right and there's no substance. On the other hand, for the person who's all substance, who maybe is not good at it, we need to help them out a little bit. Ooh, this is kind of cool. The Nebraska Accountability and Disclosure Commission. Wow. These are the folks who kind of look over the shoulders of people who are running for public office to make sure that they're following all the rules. And, people talk about this sometimes, like the rules having to do with elections sometimes are just sort of, I'm sorry, they're kind of Mickey Mouse. Like make sure that you turn 3 times wearing blue under the full moon and so on. But part of why we do this, of course, the main reason is following the rules in terms of how they're spending money, who they're getting money with, and what that means in terms of their candidacy. So this is one of the places where they make sure that we know as voters who's paying the bills behind the magic curtain. But having run for public office myself, it also is about things like how good are they at building a team? Are they able to put together a group of people who actually can um, get the information that's needed, actually follow the rules, notice the deadlines, get the work done so that we don't embarrass themselves? And we forget that part of being an elected candidate is um, building a team, being able a competency at putting together a team of people. So I have to use Roy Romer as an example. In the 4 terms that he was in office in Colorado, there were very little what you might call scandals having to do with people. And he was notorious for bringing in both Democrats and Republicans onto his team, and very, very little problems with any of those folks. He looked for quality, and that I think was one of his great strengths when he was governor, for sure. Same thing with John Hickenlooper, is that John was very good at bringing in good people. There's other folks is like all you could think of is, what were you thinking? Did you never vet that guy? Did you never look into that person's past and figure out why you're bringing them in? So for some people, a candidate who consistently misses their filing deadlines, who isn't giving the right information, it's not that they're a crook, they're incompetent. And I'm sorry, even if they're not responsible day to day for the details, guess what? What does this say about them when they're in office? That they can, in effect, hire people who are competent at looking at the details that needs to be done. So if there's a candidate you are thinking of voting for, and since you have this wonderful resource, I would check on the Nebraska Accountability and Disclosure Commission just to make sure that they were competent enough to meet the deadlines and the filing requirements and doing what they were supposed to do. And anyone can make a mistake, anyone can mess up. However, given that, if that person has a pattern of goofing off, that might be a sign that maybe that's not the best candidate for the job. So that's one of these places we look for the heads up. It's amazing how many people have no idea what a Secretary of State does. And you think of the federal Secretary of State that gets to fly around the world and sign treaties and deal with dictators and stuff like that. Nah, we don't have that much fun at the state level. I'm a small business owner, so every year I have to go online to the state Secretary of State and file a little bit of information and pay a modest fee to, for example, um, establish that our corporation, Pattern Researching, is still in business, to pay for our trade name, Pattern Research, make sure that's okay. And we have several other things we pay for. And they really are kind of like, in the best sense of the word, the secretary that pays attention to things. And one of the things that they're mostly in charge of is the elections. So while we argue back and forth on social media, what's legal, what's not legal, what's important and what's not important, you know what? You can show off your smartness by saying, well, let's go to the Nebraska Secretary of State a website and see what they say about the issues. So again, even though there's always a chance local government and state government are going to disagree on something, this is pretty much where you're going to find out what the word is on something having to do with the elections. I went and looked up for Omaha, Douglas County, and of course, like most cities and states, Denver does too, you have your own election commission. So here's another place that, rather than fantasizing, making up what the rules are and such, you can actually go to the Douglas County Election Commission and find out what's there. Again, working here in Colorado, amazed at how many people don't know that there's such a thing as the Denver Election Commission. And honestly, they were one of my clients before there was electricity, where I did consulting for them and training. And they were so sweet because when they heard that I was, well, of course, they heard right away that I was running for mayor because I filed. They were like, we're going to help you. And we had this horrible joke going on that I hope nobody ever overheard, but it was sort of like, oh, we're going to help Pat. And I said, no, you can't help me. and I'd make air quotes, all you can do is you do for any candidate. No, Pat, but we really want you elected mayor. And I said, there's no chance in heck I'm going to be elected mayor. So just do what you do for everyone else. But boy, what hardworking people. I mean, just incredible. So I assume that's true of all election commissions, and things can happen, right? Voting machines can fail, mail can fail, all sorts of things, and they get the blame. But I have to say that most of the people I've dealt with over the years are great. The problem in rural areas is usually they're given a lot to do without money or staff. And that's where I think some of the mistakes are made in more rural areas. This I thought was really good. The Voter Information Project. It's a nonprofit organization, and it was one of the few groups that I found that I felt was a nonprofit looking to give people information about people and causes, and they were going out of their way not to slant the information. And their information is part their theory is let's interview the candidates and have them speak in their own words about the issues. And we're talking one-on-one interviews, and post that information. So they're not interpreting what a candidate says. They are basically literally giving you the information from these interviews. And I thought they were kind of awesome. I was disappointed to find out they're not everywhere, but they've won national awards. I mean, I think everything I've read and looked at, I thought it was a really cool idea and something kind of unique to your part of the country. So voterinformation.org definitely would be a place that I would look. And then finally, don't wait. A whole bunch of stuff can happen that can change the ability for any of us to get our ballots in on time. For example, right now, Colorado is in a surge of new cases having to do with the virus. And our governor and our mayors are very, very concerned, and we may have a fairly serious lockdown. Now, you might remember a few months ago that local government, state and federal government, but local government also in Colorado said to the Postal Service that they wanted them to do very strict COVID protocols having to do with sorting mail. Well, those protocols would basically have shut down the mail sorting center near Denver that is stuff that, from Nebraska and Wyoming and New Mexico and everything. It would have been like a big deal, and they had to renegotiate that. I don't know what might happen in the next month or two, or the next month, if suddenly there's a big shutdown and how that's going to affect the Postal Service. And I'm not going to talk about conspiracies, and I'm not going to talk about anything else, but the practicality of that. So would you make sure that you get your vote in time? So um, you know all the secrets now. Let's see if we got any questions in. Did we have any questions or comments in? We have a little time left.
Let me see. It doesn't look like we have any questions or comments in the chat, and it doesn't look like we have any Q&A either. So
Okay.
if we do have a few minutes, if our attendees have any, just links are great, says Dolores. So thanks, Dolores. If you have anything else you want to add or ask Pat while we have her, I'm going to say that we are good to go. Awesome. Yeah, well, thank you, Dolores and Christine, for joining us today. And yes, I have a copy of the PowerPoint that Pat used today, so I will make sure to send out a copy of those if you'd like them as a PDF, just so you have those resources at your disposal. And Pat, thank you again for putting on such an amazing presentation. I learned some really good stuff, so I know I'm going to be using some of the resources that you've shared to help me with my decision making this year.
Well, my pleasure. And again, I'm not going to tell you how to vote, and I really just want you to vote smartly. So thanks very
Yep.
much.
Awesome. Yep. Voting smartly is the best thing to do. Awesome. Well, thank you everybody for joining us. Thank you, Pat. And we
Thank
will
you.
see you next time. Have a good
Okie
one,
dokie.
everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.